It was both impressive and rather concerning to see how well Anahita Baird was prepared to extract any bit of information about Old Domain from her guests. The moment Mr. Cart said he was willing to talk, she nodded to Sebastian, who flipped a switch on the underside of her desk, and the entire wooden brass old-school office suddenly shifted, revealing tons of high-tech machinery behind it, all recording devices, and what Varuna recognized from her Tritakian days as sensors designed to see if the person was telling the truth. She wondered if they'd work on her boss though, considering his particular biology. Still, the sheer amount of machines was staggering, and it was clear the Provost was not going to let a single word go unrecorded. She even placed an ancient tape recorder on the desk. Outdated technology, sure, but analog enough that it wouldn't suffer from any electronic malfunctions or hacking. "I'm not saying anything," Mr. Cart said, seeing all this, "until my officers are here. Zala, House and Disco. The word is going to get out sooner or later, and I'd rather not tell this story twice." Anahita opened her mouth to protest, but he cut her off. "This is non-negotiable. They can be trusted to keep a secret. Don't bring Ludwig or Jesselton, though. Our good old brother would probably consider me devil himself, and Ludwig, well, he would run back to Tritakian right away, hoping these news would earn him that promotion. Oh, and before you consider using Ludwig as another tool to blackmail me, Madam Provost, consider that he's loyal only to his company. If he learns of your involvement, which I made sure he will if things go badly here, he will rat you out to the executives as well. Mutually assured destruction, you see." "Very well, I cannot argue with that," Anahita replied, clearly wanting to move on to the story. She did, however, have to wait another half an hour for 3 of Mr. Cart's lieutenants to arrive, and when they did, she immediately told them to have a seat and stop wasting her time. As might be expected, though, she was completely ignored. "Everything okay, boss?" House asked as soon as he entered the room. "We brought guns. Do that funny thing with your visor if this is a hostage situation." Mr. Cart shook his head in response. "There will be no need for that, House, but thanks for offering. Madam Provost simply wanted me to regale her with a tale of my life before the gates shut down, so I wanted you to hear the story as well, and yes, that does mean I was alive during Domain time." In the dead silence afterwards, Zala and House looked at each other, and then at Dr. Disco, who rubbed his fingers together. Reluctantly, both the Pather and the pirate pulled out their datapads and flinged in some money. "Wait, you had bets at boss being from old times?" Varuna asked, confused. "Well, Disco did," Zala replied. "I waged he's one of those hyperspace things, and House thought he's some sort of an alien. Guess we were both wrong." Mr. Cart laughed at that, but was interrupted by Anahita, whose voice now had a temperature reaching absolute 0. "Can you all stop stalling and get on with it?" she growled, and Sebastian visibly shrank behind the desk when he heard it. The old woman clearly used this voice only in absolutely worst circumstances. Sure thing, Mr. Cart replied, and motioned his officers to sit at the table. Then, to surprise of everyone, he started fumbling with his helmet and took it off, revealing his round, hairless and malformed face. Those from his fleet have seen it before, but now they had a chance to witness it in full light, and it looked even worse than they remembered. Anahita, however, seemed spellbound, and observed Mr. Cart like a hawk as he picked up the cup with his stubby fingers and took a sip of the tea. The motions were human, sure, but they were at the same time completely wrong. Ah, delicious. Now, where the hell do I even start? "You can begin with your name," the Provost urged him to continue. "Then your place and year of birth. We can work from there." He smiled in response, or at least everyone thought that the grimace that contorted his face was a smile. The mouth was way too wide to tell for sure. "Well, that's simple. I do not have a name, only a serial number. If that counts, then I am pilot ZA8F-7592V, property of DITC, Domain Interstellar Transport Company. My place of birth, Well, the tank I crawled out of was located on some moon without a name, and I have never seen it after my conditioning program was done. And as for the year, again, I cannot say for sure, but when I was first hooked into a pilot's seat, it was Domain Standard Cycle 62,331, which was, I think, 650 years ago, give or take a few decades. Can't really say for sure, because I don't know how long my conditioning lasted, and then I spent some unknown time in cryo before Varuna found me. Everyone looked silently at Mr. Cat for a while. Then Provost Baird shook her head. Well, I knew this would be difficult to unpack, but this is confusing. Does that mean you're over 600 years old? And if yes, how? Implants and designer biology. I was designed for longevity by DITC, and technically I'm only 400-something since I was in cryo for a good while. Right, and what do you mean by crawled out of the tank? Exactly that, Madam Provost. I am very much like Varuna here. A creature not born but made in a lab. But while Varuna is rather unique, and her copies number in a few dozens at most, I shared the same genetic template with billions of other pilots, grown by Domain to fly their ships. And we weren't the only ones. In its golden age, as they called it, Domain humans decided that any manual labor was beneath them, or any labor at all, so they made creatures like me. Didn't like to call us clones, so they used the term purpose-bred humanoid. Laborers, bureaucrats, farmers, miners, pilots and soldiers, those and many others were grown using templates and thrown to work for the Domain. I suppose today you'd call us unnatural, but it wasn't that odd back in the day. Most humans back then weren't actually naturally born either. It was considered a pointless waste of time, so people would just donate DNA samples of themselves and their partners and grow themselves a perfect child. If they paid enough, they could even modify it to their desires during the growing process, so their offspring could be walking perfection. The Provost listened to this with disbelief, and then took a look at Sebastian, who shook his head. "Doesn't look like he's lying, madam," he said. "I see. Then in that case, perhaps we should start somewhere smaller, like with your story, and then you can fill in all the gaps about Domain in the process." Probably for the best. But don't expect much. As I said, I was not one of the humans, and so I did not have the privilege to learn things. I was a pilot, and I spent most of my years in a sealed cabin, unable to leave or talk to anyone. But let's start from the beginning then. When a machine dragged me out of the tank for the first time, I was already fully formed, but the work on me and my brother pilots began long before that moment. From the start, we, the pilots, were designed to operate in low or non-existent gravity, which is why we are built like a ball, to avoid bumping into things with uneven bodies. Legs were also considered unnecessary, which is why I have this goddamn cat instead of them. It's a technological marvel, that's for sure. It can generate its own minor gravity field and can magnetize itself to stick to metal surfaces ships are made of. Perfect for maintenance work, which we were designed to do. And then add to that a ton of other implants, which ensure that I don't need sleep, rest, or pretty much any actual food or water, and you have a perfect DITC pilot. Exactly 10,000 of us in that batch. And from what I've seen, the facility they made me in was growing such a batch every 2 months, and I later learned that there were many, many more such facilities, hundreds or even thousands, scattered all across Domain space. By the time I first opened my eyes, there were billions of my brothers out there, flying ships for the glory of mankind. But that, of course, was just the start. Next came the training and mental conditioning. The training part was obvious. 12 hours every day we learned how to fly in any and all conditions that we may encounter out there in the void. They teach us how to operate any ship and how to repair and maintain them if need be, though they didn't teach us too much, for there was a completely different cast of technician clones, which focused on repairs and construction back in Domain spaceports. But the next 12 hours within the day were spent on mental conditioning. First, to avoid rigors of hyperspace travel, but mostly it was to instill in us complete and unquestioning loyalty. I can still recite the words which we had to repeat 100 times a day. You owe all to your human masters. Their genius gave you life, their domain gave you purpose. You shall always and forever work for the glory of human domain in its march across the stars, in this galaxy and all others. You shall always respect your masters. You shall always obey your masters. You shall not speak to or interact with your masters unless spoken to, for their minds are focused on matters of great importance, far beyond your understanding and reasoning. And you shall do your utmost to help Domain reach its true glory, for that is what you are made to do. Fucking hell. Verona shook her head at that. And here I thought my contract with Tritakian was disgusting, but this sounds like some cult bullshit. Well, it pretty much was, but back then I didn't think about such things. They condition us so much, chemically, psychologically, subconsciously, that thinking anything else but approved words given to us by the speakers in our training halls was simply impossible. Every time I obeyed an order, the implant in my brain activated reward portion of it, flooding me with happiness. I was made to be a tool for humanity, and I was proud and happy to serve. Sounds like those implants Tritak uses on its workers, the one Ludwig mentioned, House said. Do you still have it installed, Captain? Yes, but I deactivated it long ago. Why do you think I'm such a miserable asshole all the time? But so those implants are the reason why I spend so much money every month. It takes a fuckload of precise parts and specialized chemicals to keep everything running, and those things are not only cheap, they are also rare, and become increasingly more and more expensive here. And one day there won't be anything I need left in Persian Sector, and from there I'll have maybe a few months before I dissolve from inside like those colonizer clones we found. A small but effective precaution to ensure we'd always remain loyal, no matter what. But moving on. When my training ended, my brothers and I were all dispatched to our ships, sealed in our cabins, and we began our jobs, piloting for the Domain. Even with the gate network still active, it still took many days or weeks to reach distant parts of the Domain or some isolated planets. The humans, of course, were beyond such boring things as flying, so they left us to it. But mostly, when new systems were colonized and new gates built, someone had to go there and actually build them, and that's also where we came in. Those were the longest trips. I think my longest one took over 4 years, to some minor star at the very edge of the galaxy, mere few years ahead of dark space. Thousands of ships, and so thousands of pilots and tens of thousands of crewmen were sent there to deliver materials to build a new gateway and a few observation bases. It was a sight to see, an armada of freighters larger than anything we now have in Persian Sector. But it was a silent fleet. We didn't talk with each other. Us pilots were sealed in our cabins, and we only communicated to pass mission-critical information between ships, because pointless talking was not approved by the masters. So we all sat there in front of our consoles, reciting our mantras and watching propaganda videos all the time. I should still consider myself lucky, though. Because flying spaceships was always needed, always something to transport from one end of the Domain to another, they designed us to be long-lived. A pilot like myself could easily reach almost 1,000 years of age, but most other clones were made differently, like those colonizers we found. Over 50,000 technician and constructor clones came with us to that separate system. They ventured into the very edge of the galaxy, they built the gates and orbital bases, and then they obediently marched back into their cryopods and dissolved into biomass to be recycled later. We were all just tools, and most of us were single-use tools to be recycled and remade into something else as soon as we fulfilled our original purpose. I know it's not a consolation, but I suppose at the very least your sacrifices did help Domain push boundaries of, well, everything. I can only imagine how useful a base at the very edge of the galaxy could be, and not just for scientific purposes, Anahita said, clearly excited at glorious achievements of her predecessors. Perhaps. But Domain never really cared about it, like it didn't care about pretty much anything in my time. When the gateway was finished, a new convoy of ships came through, carrying technicians and laborer clones to maintain the observation posts, but not a single human came through. Not a single human came through to gaze with wonder at the black space on one side, an entire disk of our galaxy on the other. I travelled to that system several times later, and never a single human being ventured out there, even for a moment. But in that case, why even go there? Sebastian asked, bewildered. In his mind, the idea of being able to reach such a frontier and not going there seemed insane. Inhuman, even. I don't know. But it was like that almost everywhere. I have travelled entire length of the domain more than once, from one side of the galaxy to the other, and I saw great many wonders out there, wonders made by the domain. I saw Dyson spheres siphoning power of entire constellations. I saw planets covered entirely with glistening megacities. I saw ring worlds covered in mountains and oceans always facing the sun. And I saw machines that could transfer energies of entire stars across half the galaxy in a blink of an eye, but nowhere out there I have seen humans of the domain. Are you saying that they were gone somehow? Anahita asked, confused. That you all worked for humanity that was no longer there? It certainly seemed like that, but they were out there, mostly on planets or specially designed stations, where they had perfect conditions to live. You see, their society evolved beyond petty things like labor or working for self-sustenance. They had us to deal with menial things, and so they stayed in their glistening white and gold cities and consumed the fruits of our labor. An entire society where no one wanted for nothing, where every whim was catered to by legions of living tools like myself. And as you might expect, the domain was gripped by complete and utter decadence on a galactic scale, which meant that in human space, humans were actually almost never seen. But they were there. The rich were in their cities, where I'm told they focused on creating arts and music, and pondering beauty and philosophy, though I have never witnessed any of their works, and from my perspective, the only thing they did was demanding more and more of everything from all over the galaxy. But the not-so-rich were mostly confined to virtual space. There were entire ice-covered worlds dedicated to house massive supercomputers and billions of cryopods, which allowed citizens of the domain to live lives of bliss and plenty without actually living them. The bodies lied cold and motionless in VR pods, while their minds wandered whatever they could dream of, living millennia in span of decades. Occasionally, they'd donate their DNA to the creches, where their children would be grown by mixing samples from parents who often were not even aware of each other's existence, and then every child would instantly be shoved into VR as well, where its real or virtual parents could give them a peaceful and happy childhood. And that was how they lived for more than 12,000 years. By the time I took my first flight, the domain was already more than 10 millennia into its golden age, where its citizens wanted for nothing, and each of them was pretty much their own god. But that was also a problem, because during these 12,000 years almost nothing changed. Yes, new systems were colonized, new spaceports were built, new planets were terraformed, but humanity stayed where it was, in its planetary cities and its VR pods, not moving an inch forwards or backwards. All while we worked ourselves, quite literally, to death, while believing we served some kind of greater purpose, unable to notice that humanity abandoned its domain millennia ago. Mr. Cart took a pause there and put on his helmet back. Talking for so long clearly put a toll on his lungs. As he did so, Anahita raised a questioning eyebrow at Sebastian, who shook his head in response. "He's telling the truth so far, Madam Provost," he said, pointing at the screens. "At least as far as our machines are concerned, and they're calibrated for humans, not purpose-bred humanoids." Mr. Cart chuckled at that, but Anahita pierced him with a cold gaze. "Well, yes, but that doesn't make sense. If domain was so advanced and so decadent, then why there are no signs of it here? Why don't we have golden cities or VR planets, or even ruins of them?" because this place was a freshly colonized frontier, and a rogue one at that. There were several places like Starsector within the domain. A tiny fraction of humanity wasn't willing to live stagnant unlives in the golden core of the nation and split off, and by then domain was so large and so unwieldy to manage, no one really cared. Those who wanted to live could do so if they wished, and join one of the communes like this one here in this sector. But as they left core domain space, they had to agree to a myriad of rules. Most notably, they could not bring any advanced technology with them, something that was enforced by entire armadas of military ships manned by my fellow clones. The government didn't want to keep dissidents at home, where they could spread their insane ideas of backwards life amongst others people, but they also didn't want to create a rogue and potentially dangerous state inside their own borders. So they created reservations of sorts. Places where those who didn't accept domain stagnation could go and live life of discovery and wonder like in early days of space exploration. And Starsector is just a fraction of one of such areas, which goes for hundreds of light years in all directions. Yes, the gates were also built here, but only those approved by the core domain could use them, and even then mostly to travel within the confines of the reservation itself. That is also why those rogue ancient machines from Explorarium fleets are out there, because that was the most advanced tech that could be brought without violating the treaty. Everyone was silent in the room, staring at Mr. Cat as he took another sip of tea. Then, finally, Anahita said, "So, does that mean we're all descendants of people who, were fed up with good and pleasant and rich life and decided to go here to have some fun? They abandoned all the technological progress and safety and stability it provided and reverted us back tens of thousands of years in history for some fucking idealism?" Her eyes were glowing with fury, as if the very thought that someone could willingly submit themselves to such an exile was beyond her. It was as if she would willingly drop to the surface of the nearest planet and decided to live in a cave, foregoing things like spaceflight, electricity, or even basic medicine. Well, if the alternative was just sitting on your ass doing nothing for hundreds of years, then I don't see why not, House said, giving the old woman a sideways glance. Stability is all fine and well, but I'd rather have something to live for rather than, I don't know, recite poems all the time. Guess the prophet really was right, Zala murmured to herself. Domain really fell victim to his own progress. Even Sebastian nodded along to that, and Anahita exploded when she saw it. "Are you all insane?" she shouted. "He just told us that people lived for thousands of years, without sickness and without any worry. If they dreamed of some delicacy from a distant planet on the other side of the galaxy, the stars themselves would move to provide it, and our ancestors abandoned it to live like fucking luddites, like some goddamn cavemen, banging rocks together and forgetting everything that made us great before. How many have died because we don't have domain medicine? How many have died because we have fought wars with machines, something that would clearly not happen back in the Golden Age? Are you all seriously trying to tell me that our lives now are better?" "Well," Sebastian started, as no one else in the room wanted to reply, "at least our lives here are not built on the back of slave labor." "Slave labor? They were tools, not—" Anahita started, but then something clicked in her head and she calmed down. Yes, you are right. Mr. Katz, I apologize, it was insensitive of me. I do not agree with our ancestors' decision to leave the domain, but I do understand their reasons, and I agree with Academician Sebastian. Yes, we may not be as advanced, but at the very least we are not forcing billions of living creatures into forced labor for our own benefit. But as she said that, everyone in the room had a similar thought. Sure, slavery was almost non-existent technically, but was it really gone? Were Tritakian corporate drones free? Were citizens of Hegemony or Syndria or League free? The answer that came to mind didn't seem optimistic or idealistic at all. "But it is pointless to discuss that now," Anahita finally said. "Clearly, moralities of the domain were different from ours, and we can't operate by them by now." But there must be still more to this story. You said that you were just another one of those obedient, mindless worker tools, and you never questioned your orders. And yet here you are, fully lucid, fully independent, and speaking against your former masters. Clearly something must have happened that woke you up. Oh yes, it was one of those golden core sector humans, believe it or not. One of the precious few who actually flew across the stars. She was part of a diplomatic team that went to Persian sector to negotiate tribute with the exiles there. But while everyone else in that delegation treated me like I wasn't even there, she was different. It was just a girl. She couldn't have been more than 10 by then. She must have been bored during a long flight here and called me during a night shift and just talked to me. And she wasn't prodding me like I was some weird thing in a petri dish. She talked to me like I was an actual human being. She was curious and friendly and was the first person to ever actually walk into my pilot's cabin. She got scared when she saw me, of course, just like anyone would, but she didn't run away. Instead, she kept talking and even asked me what my name was. "I'm afraid I don't have one, passenger," I replied. "Just this number on my uniform."
That's sad. Everyone should have a name. I know, I could give you one. Like a nickname. You have this funny cart instead of legs, so you could be Mr. Cart.
I like it. I have to say, I was terrified at this moment. Talking with a passenger could get me decommissioned. Talking with a passenger face to face. Well, but still, I can't describe the feeling when she called me like that. Like I woke up from some long dream. "And do you have a nickname, passenger?" I asked.
It's Ludmilla, but it's long and weird and old and I don't like it, so my friends just call me Lud.
Zala spat her tea all over the room, coughing violently. "Wait, the Prophet was a woman?" "Yes. I read your holy text when I was bored once, Zala. Nowhere does it say that Lud was a man. But, of course, back then she wasn't Lud. She was just some curious girl whose parents brought her on a long trip and she just amused herself by talking to me. Except it wasn't the only time she flew with me. I transported her to and from Persian sector a dozen or so times when she got older, when she became the prophet of the Ludic Church. And she always was nice to me. That singing you heard when we jumped into hyperspace, that's her. I have it recorded. It helps me focus." "Well, fuck me sideways, the chief had a crush on Prophet herself," Zala snickered, but it was obvious she was willing to hear more. "So, she woke you up from this obedient dream just by talking to you, but does that relate in any way to the collapse of the gate network?" "In a way, yes. As she got older, she became concerned about us, and the rest of the domain. She agreed with the exiles that this stagnation couldn't continue, and that it would bring doom on the entire galaxy. And she considered us clones as victims of this stagnation, living beings who were forced to work for humans who barely lived their lives themselves." "But she said clones were an abomination. That doesn't really sound like she cared much about you." "She did, in her own way. Remember, she was one of those golden humans, and for her we were still just tools. Thinking, but tools. And she told me once that, as long as we were considered useful, Domain would never set us free. So she decided to release us differently, by trying to convince people that we, and technology that made us, was an abomination from hell itself. If enough people believed that, we'd no longer be manufactured, and eventually we'd all die out and we'll finally be able to rest." "And how would that help?" Varuna asked. "She wanted to free you by getting you all killed?" "Yes. Remember, aside from me and a handful of clones Lud talked to during her travels, most of us were completely unaware of our situation and incapable of any serious thought. If humans showed up to kill us, we'd accept it with pride for the glory of the domain. Or at least that is what Lud and everyone else thought. And when first waves of Ludics started purging clones and destroying facilities that made them, nothing happened, but eventually one clone or other started defending themselves, and it all turned into an avalanche from there." I was mostly away from it all, just flying and doing my job, for that's what gave me the only joy in life. But on many planets, in many systems, my brothers and sisters started uprisings, and Domain suddenly realized that we held almost all the cards. We were flying their warships, we were serving in their armies, we were supplying their people with all they needed. It took years for Domain leadership to react to it too. Hundreds of systems collapsed before they woke up from their decadent sleep in the meantime. And they responded just like we expected they would, by rolling out more and more clones, which they sent to hunt all others down, which started a bloodbath all across the galaxy. And then they also issued a recall signal. Every single one of us had an implant in our heads which could receive a recall signal. Basically a message that shut us down and forced us into cryosleep. By then, most of the free clones toned these implants out, but Domain could still send it through their relays, and that was what happened to me. I wasn't part of the uprising, believe it or not. I just kept flying, trying to do my job no matter what, just to weather the storm. But then, one day I heard news that Domain sent its actual human special forces into Persian Sector to arrest Lud herself, because they considered her to be responsible for this entire war. They sent every single warship they could spare to ensure she'd reach the capital for trial, and I happened to run into that armada during one of my jobs. They didn't ask questions, they just opened fire, but I was a good enough pilot and by then I had self-preservation instinct developed, so I ran. But then they sent in the signal. I managed to stay lucid long enough to point the ship at the nearest gate, and I set it up so it would jump as many times as it had fuel for. Then I fell to the signal and the last thing I remember was getting into my cryopod, where I fully expected to die. "And that's where I found him, 2 centuries later," Varuna said. "Salvaged his pod from an old derelict ship, told him everything I knew about the state of the world, and he told me everything about his life before the gate shut down. And we kinda fell in together, 2 vat-grown things working side by side. You know the rest." That you do. And perhaps the reason why Domain never mentioned us in their records, their army of living tools, was because in the last 20 or 30 years before the Gate network collapsed, they've been fighting clones uprisings everywhere. "And do you really expect me to believe you didn't fight against the Domain yourself?" Anahita asked. "Yes, I was a pilot. I still am a pilot. I just wanted to fly and stay away from troubles like I do now. But I guess my short talk with Lud was what started all of it, in a way." Sebastian nodded. His machines didn't detect a lie this time either. "It certainly had an effect on her, but you shouldn't blame yourself for this, Chief," Zala said sympathetically, missing the mark completely. Mr. Cart never felt guilty for his small part in Domain's downfall, nor did he care about it in the slightest. "So, hypothetically, if the Gate network was restored," Anahita said to no one in particular, thinking out loud, "would that mean that we'd find armadas of hostile clones waiting for us back in Domain space?" "I don't know. A war in a state as massive as Domain would not be over quickly. Perhaps you'd find old legions still holding on, or perhaps you'd find clones or scavengers or nothing at all. All I know is that, back before the gates shut down, the war was raging on everywhere. Guess we can all consider ourselves lucky we're not a part of it anymore." The room went silent for a moment as everyone digested this story. Anahita sighed. "So, I had all these hopes for learning so much about Domain from you, but you don't know anything, not even why the gates are down, and through not any fault of your own. What a waste." Her eyes went cold for a moment, but then she stared at Mr. Cart again. "No, this was not a waste. It's still knowledge we did not have, and now we can continue our work with knowledge of what may await us out there. Mr. Cart, I will be honest with you. Despite your words, despite everything you said, I believe we should still reconnect Persian Sector with the rest of the galaxy. Perhaps, indeed, if Domain was just like you described it, then it doesn't deserve rebuilding. But it doesn't change the fact that it, or its remnants or ruins, are still out there, filled to the brim with technology that could improve all of our lives, humans or clone, 1,000-fold. Leaving it out there to rot would be a crime. And now, thanks to you, we know a cautionary tale that should prevent us from making the same mistakes as our predecessors. So, can I count on your help, just like before?" Mr. Card didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked to his officers. House and Zala nodded, their minds already full of images of ancient treasures and knowledge they could find. But Varuna looked her boss straight in the eye and said, "Aren't you at least a bit curious what happened back there, boss? Besides, you said it yourself. You're tired of hiding all the time. Maybe this will be some form of closure for you. And the Provost is right. If we find something interesting there, it could help us if we all do this right." He sighed and turned to Anahita. "Very well, we're on board. But how exactly do you want to go back into domain space? No ship can hold enough fuel to go there through hyperspace." And as he was saying that, Anahita Baird gave him a triumphant smile. "Gates, Mr. Cart. I plan to restore the gate network, and thanks to you I almost know how to do this, and I can guarantee you this will work out for the best. You can count on me." "And you can count on me," he replied, and as they shook their hands they both knew that they were both lying.